All right, let's roll. Well, thanks for coming to the State Wildlife Action Plan Graduate Synthesis Group Project presentation. My ear is too small for this thing, sorry. My name is Anne, and there, I just won't move my head. Presenting with me today is Yada, and we also have Michaela, Jen, and Evan here to help answer questions when we're finished. So due to the unorthodox nature of this particular group project, we've provided you with a presentation outline. The first few minutes of this presentation will be devoted strictly to background information, just to get you on board. And then from there, we will go into the three major components of this study. They included a pilot study, a distributed graduate seminar, and what UCSB referred to as our drill down topic, in which we analyzed the inclusion of wildlife movement corridor conservation in the state wildlife action plans. Then from there, we'll go into our overarching conclusions. So first of all, you're probably wondering, what are state wildlife action plans? Do I even have one? Or more importantly, are my tax dollars being spent on their design or implementation? The state wildlife action plans are political documents which assess the state of each state's wildlife and habitats, identify the problems they face, and outline the actions that are needed to conserve their wildlife over the long term. In many cases, the state wildlife action plans are acting as new cornerstones for conservation agencies nationwide. They're beginning to use the plans in all of their conservation plans in the implementation and design phases. The state wildlife action plans represents an innovative attempt to get a national assessment of conservation needs and priorities on a state-by-state basis, and help to shift some of the conservation power of planning from the federal and local levels to the state level. The primary objective of the state wildlife action plans is to keep species from being listed as threatened or endangered. The state in which you live has its very own state wildlife action plan, and I encourage you to check it out. You can go to www.wildlifeactionplans.org. So let's get down to it and talk about money. Congress created the State Wildlife Grants Program in the year 2000. The State Wildlife Grants Program provides federal money to every state and territory for cost-effective conservation planning. States were mandated to complete a state wildlife action plan by October of 2005 in order to continue to receive this funding. In many cases, funding leveraged directly from the plans enabled states to activate brand new conservation plans as outlined within their state wildlife action plans. The number one threat to wildlife conservation in the United States is habitat loss due to degradation and fragmentation. In a paper written in 2007 by Jeff Lerner and others, he states that in order for the United States to secure a strategic network of habitats to protect our wildlife, we would need to spend $250 to $500 billion. Just to put that in perspective for you, in the 10-year period between 1992 and 2001, the federal government spent only $32 billion on land conservation. Federal and state governments are simply not spending enough money to conserve our wildlife. So at the end of this presentation, we'll be passing around a bucket. And it seems as if each of you contributed $1 to $2 billion, we can assure you that your wildlife will be conserved for future generations. So each of the state wildlife action plans vary dramatically in length, detail, and content. Yet they each share a common framework of 8 required elements. The first of these elements, and arguably the most important, is for states to identify their species of greatest conservation need. Species of greatest conservation need were identified based upon state and federal Endangered Species Act listings and whether or not a species had a low or declining population. The remaining elements include a description of all habitats within state boundaries, threats to species of greatest conservation need and/or their habitats, a description of actions to conserve species and habitats, detailed monitoring plans, a description of the procedure to review the plan at an interval not to exceed 10 years, plans for coordinating with other federal, state, and local agencies, and how the state plans to engage its public in wildlife conservation. So how do we go about this? First, we read all of the state wildlife action plans in an attempt to answer questions about plan development, and then we researched further into plan implementation. In the spring of 2007, UCSB and 2 other universities conducted pilot studies. The pilot studies included completing characterization documents for each of the state wildlife action plans, and then we designed a database to help to display our results. In the fall of 2007, a distributed graduate seminar took place. For the seminar, UCSB led 7 other universities in the study of plan implementation via interviews with key state wildlife action planning coordinators and stakeholders. The culmination of the seminar was to produce a synthesis report for each state. And then in the winter of 2008, the 5 of us focused specifically on the inclusion of wildlife movement corridor conservation within each of the state wildlife action plans. Ecological information sources, scientific context, institutional settings, and social norms and concerns were recorded for each state wildlife action plan. The anticipated goal of delineating national and regional results based upon the characterization documents unfortunately could not be achieved, due in part to the semantic ambiguity of the characterization documents, but also due to the complexity and heterogeneity of the plans themselves. This map represents an output from our database. Here, states were delineated based upon the terrestrial habitat classification system they chose to use in completing their state wildlife action plans. Several similar maps were produced in our pilot study, but due to a lack of quality control between the characterizations, no formal results will be presented here. Now on to the distributed graduate seminar. The goal of the seminar was to gain an overall view of wildlife conservation activities in the United States as a direct result of the state wildlife action plans. The overarching question posed was, how do processes come together to set state and regional conservation priorities and the design and implementation of solutions across the United States? The distributed graduate seminar focused only on actions catalyzed by the state wildlife action plans or the planning process, such as collaboration between agencies, the status of implementation, and actions and monitoring in the states. The interview process helped us to clarify the role of the state wildlife action plans in state-level conservation. Each of the participating universities was assigned their own state and neighboring states. UCSB's states are shown here in green. Other participating universities included the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, Duke University, Idaho University, Indiana University, the University of Michigan, Northern Arizona University, and Texas A&M University at Kingsville. As you can see, UCSB's unique state distribution gave us a unique opportunity as well to compare state wildlife action plans on both coasts of the country. The results of the distributed graduate seminar included identifying the following: the impacts of the state wildlife action plans, the challenges to implementing them, and then identifying some enabling mechanisms to overcome implementation challenges. The state as a leader in wildlife conservation is a relatively atypical concept, since wildlife conservation is usually carried out at the federal and local levels, with the exception of game species conservation. As a direct result of the state wildlife action plans, states hope to emphasize non-game species conservation more and shift to more of a habitat-based approach in protecting their biodiversity. In some cases, we were able to identify partners that played extremely important roles in plan development and implementation. These included the Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, the Bureau of Land Management, the Department of Transportation, among others. Sectors that were unfortunately less participatory in plan development and implementation included local planning organizations and private landowners. In some cases, the state wildlife action plans reinforced or stimulated collaboration between different agencies, while in other cases, states were not really collaborating at all. But one successful example of collaboration is the formation of the Northeast Regional Conservation Needs Program. The objectives of the program included identifying landscape-scale regional conservation issues by leveraging funds, pooling resources, and prioritizing actions as outlined in each of the regional states' state wildlife action plans. In some cases, the state wildlife action plans had resounding effects on other conservation organizations as well. One example is in Delaware, where the Delmarva Ornithological Society was able to update its breeding bird atlas for the first time in 20 years as a direct result of state wildlife grant funding. Across all states, the following key challenges to implementation were identified. Limited capacity emerged as the #1 challenge to plan implementation, and prioritization proved difficult for many states. For example, in Maryland, nearly half of its resident species were listed as species of greatest conservation need. Greater outreach to other organizations and the public is desperately needed, and mapping has yet to produce priority areas in many states. In addition, some states need to produce a granting process to more efficiently distribute their new incoming state wildlife grant funds. In some states, implementation has not even begun due to the lack of specific conservation tasks and goals. As I mentioned, several innovative projects have stemmed as a direct result of the state wildlife action plans. However, one major result of the distributed graduate seminar was that it was very difficult to discriminate between implementation and innovative projects of implementation as a result of the plans and projects that were ongoing prior to and during development of the plans. So for example, you may be sitting there thinking, well, in my state, I can think of several innovative conservation projects that weren't even mentioned in this presentation. Well, you may be right, but if they weren't delineated specifically in the state wildlife action plans, then they weren't a part of this project. This illustrates an interesting example of why it's so important for agencies to be collaborating. In future iterations of the state wildlife action plans, if many or all conservation organizations were able to list all of their actions in one document, this would reduce redundancy, helping to spend conservation dollars more efficiently. In addition to collaboration, we identified various enabling mechanisms to overcome implementation challenges. These included prioritizing habitats and species, shifting conservation actions to the appropriate management levels, building agency capacity via training wildlife coordinators in grant writing, monitoring, and participatory planning, mapping priority areas via geographic information systems, expanded monitoring of non-game species, further outreach to local organizations and the public, incorporating climate change and land use planning into future iterations of the state wildlife action plans, and more directly linking conservation actions to their specific sources of funding.
Thank you, Anne. So in addition to the pilot study and the distributed graduate seminar, each campus identified a topic of interest to pursue in further detail. UCSB focuses on wildlife movement corridors, and in particular, their relationship to the state wildlife action plans. So what are wildlife movement corridors? Well, there are many definitions that can be found within the literature. We define them as geographic areas that may vary in scale, that are within or between states and allow for the natural movement of wide-ranging terrestrial mammals. And this includes both game and non-game species. So this figure illustrates a few examples of wildlife movement corridors. To the your left side is the riparian corridor, which is a corridor which runs alongside a stream or a river. Next to that, we have stepping stones, patches of habitat in between two core areas. Below that, the landscape corridor, which basically contains a variety of habitat types or ecosystem functions. The traditional linear wildlife movement corridor, and finally a wildlife movement overpass. So to address this topic, we focused on two scales. The first question addresses it in a national scale and focuses on the emphasis that state wildlife action plans placed on wildlife movement corridors within their plans. The second question is on more of a regional scale and focuses on the influence that state wildlife action plans had on conservation efforts within 5 states in the western US. These states are California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Nevada. So why are we interested in wildlife movement corridors? Well, there are many reasons in the science and policy realm. For one, fragmentation is listed as a leading threat in most state wildlife action plans, and addressing this threat is critical for the long-term survival of many species, including the grizzly bear cubs shown in this photo here. So the protection of wildlife movement corridors could promote genetic dispersal, migration, and the establishment of new populations in new geographic areas, as well as potentially mitigate threats of climate change. We are also seeing an increased interaction with humans and wildlife, especially carnivores. The protection of wildlife movement corridors could limit this interaction. Finally, when one thinks about landscape movement corridors or wildlife movement corridors, you typically have to think on a larger scale. And since these animals do not tend to follow state boundaries, this could not only promote collaboration between state agencies and organizations, but also allow conservation to shift from more of a species-based approach to habitat-based or landscape scale approaches. So we approach these two questions. Remember, the first question is on a national scale and focuses on the emphasis. In order to do this, we performed a word search, including the following terms: corridor, linkage, movement, habitat connectivity, and wildlife connectivity. This search was then combined with a qualitative assessment of the content surrounding the search terms. I'll explain this in a little bit more detail on the following slide. So remember, the second question focuses on a regional scale and the influence that state wildlife action plans had on corridor conservation in the 5 states. So in order to approach this, we conducted interviews in the 5 states with conservation professionals. So now I'd like to talk to you about our results. The first question, the national scale and emphasis focused question, is shown here in this graph. This table illustrates the qualitative criteria that we used. For example, were specific species identified in relation to wildlife movement corridors? Were specific actions recommended? And did the State Wildlife Action Plan actually include a map or maps of corridors? Combination of the word search and fulfillment of these criteria then allowed us to group all of the states into 3 bins: high, medium, and low. The high bin is shown in the darkest green color and represents those states which had the highest influence or emphasis on wildlife movement corridors within their state wildlife action plans. The low bin is shown in the yellow, and these states are those states which had the lowest emphasis on wildlife movement corridors within their state wildlife action plans. The remaining states were placed within the middle bin. So this map illustrates our national results. Remember, the table before is also our national results. This is simply in a different format. So the first thing that you might see is the heterogeneity of the emphasis that state wildlife action plans actually placed on corridor conservation. Secondly, there are definitely notable differences between adjacent states. For example, in the Northeast region over here, you see this dark green grouping of high emphasis states. This could be a result of the Northeast Regional Conservation Needs Program, as Anne mentioned earlier in the presentation. Another interesting thing is that Maine is also in this region. However, it's been given a low ranking as far as wildlife movement corridor emphasis in its state wildlife action plan. Now, this could be due to the relatively high amount of rural land within this state. So moving west, Kansas does stand out in the middle of the country as well, as having a relatively high emphasis on their inclusion of wildlife movement corridors within their state wildlife action plan. This state was given this rating due to the fact that it mentioned riparian corridors as avenues of wildlife movement, especially for black bear and gray fox. And then finally, I'd like to point out 3 states in the West, bordering Washington and Oregon. That is Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, home of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Well, these states have a relatively low rating compared to their neighbors. This could be due to the relatively high amount of federally owned land in these states, thus reducing the power for the state agencies to do conservation. So I mentioned earlier that fragmentation is a leading threat in most state wildlife action plans. So why is it that we're not seeing higher emphasis in more states in this country? Well, for one, corridor conservation is only one conservation tactic. Others include core area conservation, species management, and also habitat restoration. Also, it may not be the highest priority for some of these states. You remember those 8 required elements that Anne mentioned at the beginning of the presentation? Well, wildlife movement corridor is not included in that list. And finally, the geography of a state could influence the ability for it to conserve wildlife movement corridors. And I'll show an example of that a little bit later on in the presentation. So now for the regional scale question, which had to do with the influence that the state wildlife action plans placed on wildlife movement corridor conservation in the states. In order to do this, we conducted interviews. And interviewees agreed that corridor conservation is critical for the long-term success of many large species. Also, 4 out of 5 of the states in our region, their state wildlife action plans did not actually result in projects related to corridor conservation. It could be due to the fact that it is fairly early in the implementation process. Also, collaboration is key for successful conservation projects. Important collaborators include the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Fish and Game, the Forest Service, the Department of Transportation, and the Nature Conservancy. Also, interviewees agreed that corridor planning encompasses not only a variety of habitats, but species of greatest conservation need and game species. And sprawl is an increasing threat in all 5 of these states, and it also furthers fragmentation. Finally, climate change is not on the forefront of conservation in this region. So remember the 4 out of 5 states that I said that the State Wildlife Action Plan did not actually result in a project? Well, Idaho and Nevada are 2 of these states. These 2 states had a medium emphasis of wildlife movement corridors within their State Wildlife Action Plan. In Idaho, the focus of corridor conservation is mainly with highway crossings, and the Department of Transportation is working to minimize roadkill, specifically along these 2 highways, Highway 12 and Highway 95. In Nevada, the geography of the state heavily influences the ability for the state to plan and conserve wildlife movement corridors. This state has a basin and range topography. You can kind of see this on the graphical map I've shown on the slide. However, the state is identifying corridors for migratory species, and there does seem to be a shift towards non-game species conservation. California and Washington are 2 of the other 4 states that did not have projects that directly resulted from the State Wildlife Action Plan. However, these 2 states had a high emphasis on wildlife movement corridors within their plans. California has an excellent example of an existing project focusing on wildlife movement corridors, or more specifically, linkages. This can be shown in this map here. The red arrows represent project linkages, and the dark green are protected lands. In Washington, the Interstate 90 project is a project that is currently underway, but is not a result of the plan. This project involves a widening of the Interstate 90 corridor, a highway which runs from east to west over the Cascade Range. Along with this widening, they plan to include several wildlife movement overpasses. The potential areas for these wildlife movement overpasses are shown in the blue boxes along this photograph, or this figure. And then the photograph in the lower left is what this might end up looking like. So Oregon is the only state in our region, those 5 states, whose plan not only had a high emphasis on the inclusion of wildlife movement corridors, but the project actually resulted from the plan. This is the Wildlife Movement Strategy. It's the first large-scale corridor project in the state, and it involved collaboration with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Transportation. Their next steps are to identify prioritized corridors and also include the Oregon State Wildlife Action Plan priority habitats and species of greatest conservation need. So there are a few challenges to corridor conservation. Of course, funding, limited funding that is, and limited outreach. Also, the multi-jurisdictional nature of projects leads to differing prioritization of threats, as well as prioritization of species and habitats. So we need new tools to address these challenges. Maps are excellent for showing where corridors could be placed, and from pilot projects, we can learn from mistakes and apply them to future projects. So what's going on now? Well, there is actually a new bill which links Washington State to continental conservation. This is Senate Bill 5318. It was first introduced in 2007 and has now been reintroduced in the 2008 legislative session. This bill would link conservation efforts in Washington State to the continental work of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. This could essentially promote collaboration and cooperation between state agencies. So what are the overarching conclusions from the pilot study, the distributed graduate seminar, and finally the Wildlife Movement Corridor Project? Well, first, the influence of the state wildlife action plans is hard to determine. In many cases, implementation has not yet begun, and in some cases, the conservation activities in the state are not illustrative, or the State Wildlife Action Plan is not indicative of the current state of conservation in these states. Again, the problem of limited funding and staffing and limited outreach. Also, collaboration is key to successful conservation projects, and the existing political climate does dictate conservation. Again, differing organizations have differing goals, priorities, and staffing potential. Also, land ownership does influence conservation. Depending on if land is federally owned, state-owned, privately or publicly owned, would change the opportunities that exist for conservation in those lands. Again, the importance of prioritization and mapping, and also choosing appropriate scales at which to apply conservation projects. And finally, incorporating potential impacts of climate change will be important to the long-term success and conservation of many species. So overall, though, the State Wildlife Action Plans, it's good news. They have had a positive influence on the state of biodiversity conservation in the United States. So we would like to thank the following people for their role in this project. Our advisors, Sarah Vickerman, Dennis Fig, Frank Davis, and David Stomes. The interviewees and participants, UCSB students Kavita Hain, Amy Locke, Heather Abbey, and Tim Kidman. Our family and friends for their unyielding support in this process, and the Donald Bren School of Environmental Science and Management, UCSB, for the wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much for coming to our presentation. We would be happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the mic around, and when you respond and answer questions, would you give your name?
Hi, I was wondering if you could explain in more detail how the basin and range topography prevents the corridor being facilitated. Is it the east-west movement of the animals that's being prevented?
Okay, hi. So the question pertains to basin and range topography and the effects of wildlife movement, is that right? And I'm Jen Paludi, and I guess I'll give you an example of basin and range topography affecting wildlife movement corridors, and that is persistent in the state of Nevada, where there are kind of these, basins and ranges that kind of create pockets of habitat rather than creating really obvious movement corridors for species. So in that case, the state is more focused on conserving linkages between these habitat pockets than necessarily conserving a linear type corridor. So I guess the topography might lend itself to defining a corridor differently in different areas, but it will influence wildlife movement drastically in a particular state. I lost my train of thought. Did I answer your question, or? Yeah.
Do you feel, especially in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, that it's better if the conservation efforts are federally controlled or state controlled? Or which had better results?
The question has to do with whether or not federal versus state conservation is more effective, and my name is Michaela. We actually didn't really look at that as part of our project. However, in that area that Yada was talking about in the presentation, there is a lot of federal land, and species are able to move on that federal land. But our lens was the state wildlife action plans. So in some cases, federal agencies collaborated with the state, but not in every case. Does that answer your question?
Hi, I wanted y'all to go back to the map about the emphasis for each state, and you had different reasons. You brought up different reasons why maybe one would have high emphasis and one would have low. So I was wondering if you found any common traits between the states with low emphasis or the states with high emphasis. For instance, were the states more rural, or were the high emphasis states more fragmented between all the states in the union, not just your 5 or 6?
Okay, my name is Evan, and sorry, to clarify your question, you're wondering if we explored similarities in characteristics of states, such as urbanization. We hadn't done that, but it looks like Yada has moved to this slide where this pretty much says how we came up with our characterization of these states. And as you can see, states like Arizona and California, which were rated as high, they all took advantage of using the plan to identify corridors, to specify species that may need them, habitats that may need them, specific actions, which are just usually, in many ways, case studies, which are mentioned at the end, that pertain to specifically regions that would benefit from corridors. So this is the extent of our analysis. We couldn't really go any further and speculate. It would not really be fair to speculate about why the states did what they did. Does that answer your question?
Aside from some of the obvious fixes like increasing funding and creating more of a priority for conservation among states, would you have any recommendations, or did you come across anything to improve some of the success rates across the board, I guess? And of those states that weren't fully participating, were they doing other programs other than the wildlife action plans that were showing some success?
Okay, so the question's kind of two parts. What other improvements can be made within the plan, and then kind of, what was the second part?
Of those not fully participating,
projects.
did they have other state-mandated programs or plans?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part of your question first. And California is a state where there's a lot of money being put into conservation, and there are many projects on the ground running that are not at all identified in the action plan. And the action plan is largely used as a framework to guide implementation. But because of all these successful projects already concurrently going on, there's not a huge drive to, you know, their funding that they get for these state wildlife grants is very small compared to other smaller states. And then the first part of your question is identifying other modes of success to kind of increase cohesiveness across the nation. And I guess one of the main findings that we've already iterated here is that all these plans are so heterogeneous, and even the language in the plan is very different. And there are some states who identify almost all of their species that exist there as needing conservation or species of great conservation needs. So there's a huge lack of standardization among just the language of the plans alone. So kind of within these plans are going to be under review, and I think every 5 to 10 years they have to come up with a new planning cycle, and they have to incorporate changes. And I think for the next planning cycle, kind of standardizing this language in the plans and standardizing things across states and communicating between agencies is going to play a big part in kind of creating a more national picture of conservation. Good question.
Do the creators or the owners of these plans in the states ever get together on a national scale to talk about some of these issues?
The question is whether or not the writers of the plan, which is usually the state agency, and sometimes it's contracted out to independent writers, whether or not they collaborate nationally. We actually didn't really come across anything like that. There were some examples of regional collaboration and where neighboring states collaborated. I think it was Anne mentioned the Northeast Regional Conservation Needs Program is a program that's directly a result of the wildlife action plans, and all of the states in the Northeast collaborate together and work on projects that are specifically transboundary projects, and 4% of each state's funding goes towards those projects. So that's a regional example, and then there are a lot of other examples where in writing the plan, states worked with neighboring states and trying to come up with similar databases and try and come up with similar impacts and solutions. So, but nationally, not to my knowledge.
Can I add on to that, Michaela?
Yes.
Can you still hear me?
No.
I would say that after interviewing the authors of the plans, it's really clear that staffing and funding is so tight, and they really just don't even have time. The fact that they produce these plans on top of all the other activities that go on within their agency is kind of a miracle in some cases. And so maybe asking them to come together and come up with a national assessment is going to probably make them angry, but that could be something we could recommend for the future iterations, is that, okay, now that you have this standard form, what are you going to do with it? So that will be interesting to see, just because the plans were really only published in 2005, so they're in the beginning phases. But as they gain some political weight, it'll be interesting to see what sorts of collaborations emerge.
Last question.
Can you go back to the slide of the overpass corridor? This should be a pretty basic question. Have those, you showed sort of a prototype of one and what it might look like. Is that something that's been tried and you have any sort of studies on? And could you is it just a grass-covered bridge, sort of like a pedestrian walk that animals go on? So just want to know a little more about those overpass corridors. Thanks.
Well, projects like this have been implemented. I actually personally don't know about any specific projects.
I can.
Yeah, but
This is actually in Banff, which I think is in Canada, and this is existing. So they know how to do this. It's basically, you know, man-made structure built over a highway or, you know, train tracks, and put dirt, plant trees, and vegetation. So.
And in order to encourage wildlife to actually use that as opposed to hopping across the road, in many cases there are fences all along the highway that kind of funnel wildlife onto the safe overpass.
And this has been pretty popular in European countries, for sure. There's lots of case studies there. So.
But this isn't the only option to facilitate wildlife movement. This is just one example.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in this area, but it's great getting your analysis of it. Thank you all for coming, and